Welcome everybody at the DIW Berlin. Welcome everybody from online. Thank you for joining us today. It's a great day because today we launch our new DIW OECD Industrial Strategy Dialogues. We discuss long whether it's dialogue or dialogues. Actually, dialogues is better because we will continue to talk to each other for a while. This is a new event that is dedicated to one of the most pressing questions in economic policy, which is which role should industrial strategy have to address the major challenges that we are facing, from decarbonization of our economy to digitization, the role of AI, the resilience of global value chains, the issue of strategic sovereignty. And these topics come at the center of the discussion in academia, but also among policymakers. And many countries have started developing new strategies. The UK published an industrial strategy last year. Austria is talking about it, and many other countries around the world. So successful industrial strategies require well-designed policy that coordinates many areas, from trade to competition, technology, innovation policies, standard setting, regulation, skill development. And that is exactly what we would like to do with this series of dialogues, to connect all these dots and think what role an industrial strategy can play to connect these dots. And this series is a joint initiative between the DIW Berlin and the OECD. We have been collaborating for many years, and we are back now with this new initiative on a specific topic. And the aim is to provide a platform for dialogue between stakeholders, policymakers, and researchers on these important topics. Today, we open with a first session on the intersection between industrial strategy and trade. I don't want to say more about that because Nicola will introduce the session, but this is just the beginning. I can already announce the next meeting will be on January 26, 2026, and the next meeting will have a focus on the interaction between competition and industrial strategy, and then later session will also follow and address issues like artificial intelligence, the green transition, energy security, defense, and more. We plan to continue these dialogues throughout the next year. So stay tuned. We will send out invitation. And finally, I see that Brian is sitting here, so I'm very thankful. Brian Cahin is the person who made this possible by generously supporting us. So thank you very much, Brian. It's really great that you made this possible. And now I hand over to Nicola Brandt, who is the moderator for today. Welcome again, welcome online, and enjoy this dialogue.
Well, thank you. I don't want to add much. First of all, thank you to our friends from DIW for launching this dialogue series that's going to be long. Thank you to Brian Cahin, who's the spiritus rector of what we're going to see. And I think actually we are launching this series with perhaps one of the most important, but also at the current juncture, one of the most complicated aspects of industrial policies, because, well, trade has always been, of course, an area open and free markets that can spur competition, that can spur innovation. But at the same time, when we think about industrial policies, subsidies, there are obvious tensions at the same time. And now we live in a world where there are perhaps even more tensions in the trade area. So I'm very happy to announce our OECD Trade Director, Marion Jansen, who will introduce the subject. And after that, I have a brilliant panel to dive a little bit deeper even into the subject. But I will introduce my panel after that. Marion, please, you have the floor.
Much and pleasure to be here. Is the microphone working? Yes. It's good. I would like to start my intervention with a sentence from a Visconti movie that some of you may know, others may be too young to know it. Il Gatto Pardo, I only know the Italian title. It is a sentence said by a prince who is going to fight with the rebels. And the sentence is quite famous, and he says, in order for things to stay the same, everything has to change. My name is Marion Janssen. I'm the director of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate at the OECD. And when talking about industrial policy and free trade, one thing I would like not to change, and that's the existence of a rules-based trading system. And therefore, I would like to invite you to continue to think of this initial statement, 4 things to stay the same, everything has to change, when you listen to my presentation. I'm not sure whether this works. So I'm going to make changes here. Good. So we are here today, and I invite you to start looking back at the past 20 years of the rules-based trading system. And I would like you to think of what may have been going on at that time in terms of industrial policy. Because when we open a discussion like this today, we think of, oh, many countries that are OECD members, we have 38 member countries, are considering to use industrial policies. But maybe we have already seen this before. Here you see data from 2005 to 2023. They represent data on subsidies. These data come from the so-called MAGIC database at the OECD. It's a firm-level data set that looks at how much subsidies firms were receiving. And the subsidies are expressed in terms of percentage of their revenue. And here you see a number of sectors. You see the most subsidized sector, according to this data, is the solar panel industry. But you see also a few sectors that I point at here with arrows. It's the vehicle, the car industry, but you also see steel, aluminium, semiconductors. And what steel and aluminium have in common is that they're used to build cars. And what semiconductor, why do I point at semiconductors? Because semiconductors are particularly important for e-vehicles. So keep these 4 sectors in mind and think cars. And being in Germany, that's something we like to think about. Think in particular e-vehicles. So these sectors have been subsidized a lot. Here a chart, I only look at one sector here. That's the sector for semiconductors. And what we see here is when you look at who has been giving these subsidies, we see one country appearing very high. That's China. And so imagine, in a year like 2023, a typical semiconductor company in China would receive subsidies worth 10% of its revenue. That makes you quite competitive in international markets. Without having analyzed the impact on international markets, that's the type of subsidy, the level of subsidy that will influence international trade. I will not have similar charts for other sectors, but in most sectors that I have shown, China is by far the most subsidizing, the strongest subsidizer. Now, subsidies is one element one can use for industrial policies. Export restrictions is another one. Now, what do we see here? If, for instance, you want to become an important player in a sector that uses cobalt, graphite, nickel, or lithium, and you have access to these raw materials, if you then restrict access of this raw material to others, you give yourself a comparative advantage. Now, what we have seen is that export restrictions on cobalt, graphite, nickel, lithium, and in particular, on cobalt, graphite, and nickel have increased over time and are quite high. What these critical raw materials have in common is that they are inputs into batteries. Batteries are important for e-vehicles. Batteries are important for e-vehicles. The semiconductor makes the batteries work with the machine, and then we had aluminium and steel also go into a car. All these raw materials that I just mentioned, graphite, lithium, cobalt, nickel, it turns out that they're highly concentrated in global markets and that China in many of them has a huge market power at the processing stage. And they often also own the mines that do not necessarily, that sometimes in the case of graphite are in China, but in the case of nickel, for instance, are in Indonesia. So when you see export restrictions on nickel from Indonesia, that is often to the advantage of a mining company that is Chinese. Here we have the car. So this e-car has received subsidies as a car, has taken advantage of subsidies on aluminium, subsidies on semiconductors, subsidies on steel, and it has privileged access to many of the raw materials that are used to build a battery because other countries cannot access this thanks to export controls. Now, I'm not sure whether you heard a lot about e-vehicles and how competitive they are currently, but I think when I look at this, and when we have heard now that China used this entire battery of elements as a policy in the past 20 years, then it looks to me like a very successful industrial policy. And knowing how much concern there is in the car industry in Europe right now about competition from Chinese cars, I think it's also a kind of industrial policy that has had an important effect on global markets. This is where we are. This is only one market. Solar panels, you saw, that was the most subsidized one. We are not even discussing. Now, that was, I showed you data until 2023. This was going on. Now, some of our members, in particular one of our members, well, let's say it, the United States, in recent years or in recent months, has imposed a lot of tariffs. Tariffs on steel, tariffs on aluminium, tariffs on cars. There's a discussion, that's the light blue here, electronic equipment, to increase tariffs on semiconductors. So many tariffs, and tariffs in particular in these areas in these sectors that I've been mentioning to you before. Now, this chart here, what it shows is the effect of these tariffs on international trade. So what we expect from these tariffs is that trade is reduced. And when you believe in trade being good for growth, when you believe that tariffs are not in line with the multilateral trading system, then this is an unhappy picture. And one can say what a country like the United States is doing is threatening global markets, potentially the rules-based international trading system. But, I mean, the picture before the tariffs was also not very rosy for the multilateral trading system. So how did we get here? We have rules at the multilateral level for the use of at least particular aspects of industrial policy, in particular subsidies. Those rules exist at the World Trade Organizations, at the WTO. And those rules are meant to avoid that a country uses subsidies in such a way that it creates damage in other trading partners. Now, for years, OECD members, including the United States, including the European Union, have raised concerns about the use of subsidies by China in the WTO. For years, there have been disputes about this matter. Sometimes those disputes were won by OECD countries and lost by China. And then sometimes when China lost, that was overruled in the appellate body at the WTO. This is a phenomenon that has been taking place over years, has started early in the 2000s. It's not there are different views by experts on why the rulings on subsidies went in the direction they went. But after many years, the unhappiness was such in the United States that they did not support the reappointment of appellate body judges. And we now have a situation where the WTO dispute settlement system does not have an appellate body anymore. But apparently, what is expressed is that some WTO members had the impression subsidization was happening, but the multilateral trade rules were apparently not picking that up. Now, our work at the OECD around subsidies, but also on export constraints, gives indeed the impression that those subsidies were being provided. But at the time, there was no access to firm-level type of data like the one we are having now. Now, so we are in a situation that is not rosy. No appellate body anymore at the WTO. A lot of subsidization and export credits by now all over the place, and a use of tariffs. All this doesn't look anymore like a strong multilateral trading system and like a rosy situation for global markets. We could now sit down and be pessimistic and wait for what is going to happen, but in the meantime, action is taking place. What is already happening? At the WTO, there are discussions on how to move forward. These discussions focus on the subsidy rules. There's an agreement called the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. There's a discussion on what to do about this. The focus is on subsidies, even though the term industrial policy starts to be used, with industrial policies being broader than subsidies. There's a discussion on maybe we need more transparency on subsidies. The transparency mechanism didn't work. Maybe we need new rules, and maybe we need these rules not to only focus on subsidies, but on broader packages, on support policies, on industrial policies. Something else is happening in parallel. Small groups of countries, and they tend to involve OECD members, meet around specific supply chains on the specific sectors. Notably here, GEFSEC, that stands for the Global Forum on Steel Access Capacity. This is a forum that was already created a number of years ago by the G20. It's facilitated by the OECD. Here, discussions are taking place on how to reduce excess capacity in global markets, or rather how to ensure that in markets that are not China, there is still a possibility to produce steel. And here the discussion is also on how to coordinate on the use of subsidies, tariffs, other types of industrial policies in order to intervene in steel markets. Steel markets important for cars, as I mentioned before. And G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan, that's a plan that just came out of the G7 Canadian presidency, where G7 countries, all of them are OECD members, also together with a number of partners, also OECD members, are discussing how to collaborate on critical minerals. Critical minerals, as I mentioned before, important for building batteries and hence important for e-vehicles, but also important, for instance, for wind turbines. So discussions at the WTO focusing on subsidies. Other initiatives that I think already go further than discussions, even are at the negotiation stage, and where coordinated action is being discussed. Interesting here, they tend to be at a sectorial level. They tend to involve smaller groups of countries, not entire WTO membership, but that doesn't mean that they may not be open for other WTO members. And third, they do not necessarily, unlike the WTO negotiations that take subsidies as the starting point, these supply chain initiatives or sectorial initiatives do not take subsidies necessarily as the starting point for action. They take as starting point for action a level of concentration in a global market, an over-dependency on one actor, an over-dependency that creates vulnerabilities. At the directorate that I lead, we are supporting all these processes in one way or the other, sometimes more visible, sometimes less visible. Also, from the OECD point of view, we have a language at the political level that positions the OECD in this space. I would like to invite you to read this sentence from the 2024 Ministerial Council statement at the time under Japanese presidency. Here the sentence reads, "We commit to responding to comprehensive strategies to use non-market policies and practices that distort a global level playing field." Well, comprehensive strategies, that looks like the picture that I just showed you with the car in the middle. as well as other practices that create strategic dependencies and systemic vulnerabilities, which can then be exploited through economic coercion, like export restrictions. If you, country A, you don't do what I wish, country B, then I, country B, don't export to you anymore a product that you absolutely need. So here a commitment to respond together of 38 countries that are members of the OECD. In the directorate I lead, we support all these discussions at the WTO, the supply chain initiatives, of course, the discussions for the OECD at the ministerial level through a number of initiatives. I mentioned only 3 of them. There are many more. We have a network called the Trade Chief Economist Networks, where we bring together senior economists or chief economists from the ministries of all of our members to explore together what we know about the functioning of different supply chains, how we can measure concentration within the supply chain, how we can measure vulnerabilities within the supply chain, because those vulnerabilities are potentially the trigger for action among like-minded countries. We published in June this year for the first time a major report called the Supply Chain Resilience Review, where we published some of the data on overdependencies, but we also propose how countries can work together to strengthen their collaboration on critical supply chain, for instance, by having collaboration on regulatory issues and to start trading more among countries that have similar expectations when it comes, for instance, to labor standards. So facilitate collaboration among like-minded countries through regulatory collaboration and make your supply chains more resilient. And last but not least, in the Critical Supply Chain Forum, that's an umbrella term where we bring together individual supply chains like the ones I just mentioned, but also, for instance, the medical supply chain, agri-food supply chain. We bring together actors from the public and the private sector and from regulatory agencies to discuss together how to make their supply chain more resilient. And last but not least, this MCM, the meeting of the Council at ministerial level at the OECD, it will take place early June 2026 under Finnish presidency, and the focus will be on industrial policy. So this will be a moment to change everything, and hopefully in order for everything to stay the same, at least in order for a rules-based trading system to survive in a new shape, but for rules to continue to exist. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Marion, for this introduction. And please, you can already perhaps take a seat here. I think here would be good, to the very left, if you want to. And I will ask my others. So I'm very privileged to welcome Wolfgang Niedermark from the mighty German Industry Association, who is, overseeing the trade issues there and will be able to tell us a lot about the cars we just saw, I'm sure. And Christian Vorweg is the lead of trade policy at the German Ministry of Economics. And I hope we can now see Sonali Chaudhry. She should join us on the screen, I hope, and she will be our fourth discussant. Sonali, can you hear us? Welcome. Okay, so my panel is full. Maybe... Well, I will start with you, Wolfgang Niedermark. So, I mean, usually we think these days, we think in very bleak terms about trade, globalization, how it's all going forward. But I always, it gave me a bit of hope and energy, what Marion told us, a way forward where perhaps we talk about dependencies, vulnerabilities in other terms than thinking about the subsidies, etc., and perhaps get together with smaller groups of countries to work out solutions. Is that a way forward? Is that a way forward that you can imagine that could work?
Yes, of course. But before I answer this question, I would first state that we don't consider ourselves to be very mighty. I would wish that we have some power, more power, but we are part of this game, and we are now moderating in a way. We are the voice of German industry, but also the internal voice, the external, so to advocate for our interests, but also the internal voice to explain what's going on. And I tell you that is sometimes a harder job because all what you have been describing is, of course, very bad news for our members and the corporates because they wish that this old system you have been describing as well would survive in a way we think it cannot. And so I don't see for the time being so much hope because we are in an interregnum period where the old system, the old multilateral rule-based order is being destroyed, actively destroyed. Our position is that we do not contribute to the destruction, but we observe it and we try to defend it to a certain extent. But our expectation is we cannot rescue it. So we are in between the good old multilateral order based on WTO and extensions on FTAs. So we have a very sophisticated system, which was based on efficiency, so benefits for everyone, and the ultimate utopia of a level playing field, which we have never seen, but we were always striving for. We don't see that any longer. Not nobody, but most partners or actors on this field are not interested in this level playing field any longer. The biggest one is US now with these crazy ideas of liberalization day and solving all the problems with tariffs. Then China, as you have displayed, with a strong industrial policy anyway, has not been serving the old system so far. I was always interpreting the system by its own interests. And then many other countries in the world where we see that they enter into a strategic flexibility. So we come from efficiency to strategic thinking. Where is my individual, not multilateral, individual advantage? Mm-hmm. And perhaps we have to enter into this group as well. And then your question was, who might be the partners? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We think that we interpret our role totally different. So far, we have been convinced that we have the best system. The system was in place. We work on that and develop it further and further. And we call it change by trade, Wandel durch Handel. Mm. That has always been an excuse because we were expecting that there is also political change and never been, with a very few examples. And now we have to acknowledge that, yes, there is some change by trade, but it's not the other side who is changing, China, but we are changing. We are forced to change our own position and enter into industrial policy and copy it in a way, not copy, but do it ourselves. Mm. And it's very difficult. In some of our groups and committees, people leave the room if we talk about industrial policy. Remember when Mr. Altmaier came up with the term, everyone was shocked. No, that's not our concept. Now we have to acknowledge and to accept to a certain degree that we also have to go into strategic industrial policies. We are not used to it. We don't like it. It's not in our DNA. We don't like all these defensive instruments. We don't like the subsidies. We would definitely prefer a different system. But the circumstances are not like that. Mm-hmm. So who could be the rest of a like-minded group? Perhaps we dig deeper into it. It's, of course, Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, some others, where we could still find partners. Perhaps we discuss it in a second round. That would be our hope. But actually, everyone is fighting for him or herself for the time being.
Yeah, that sounds a lot bleaker, I have to say. But perhaps I can move to Christian now, because it sounded a lot like within German industry, Wolfgang Niedermark said, well, we have to moderate internally, we have to convince companies that the old world is gone in some ways. I know you're a big defender also of the rules-based trading system. Wolfgang Niedermark just, he suggested, well, it's over, we have to find our own strategic industrial policies. My question to you would be, well, how do you adjust in this new world? And is it mainly things like, countervailing tariffs, so basically the old WTO world you think about if you think about strategic industrial policies or promoting new technologies through your own subsidies? I mean, the climate Klimadifferenzverträge, how do you call them? Well, there are many instruments that are already being used in Germany, in Europe, etc. Is this the main point, or is it also, do we need new concepts to think about what it means to be vulnerable, what it needs to be dependent, and go about it in a different way, the way Marion suggested a little bit? Look at supply chains in a much more, micro sense, perhaps. What are they? Where are the vulnerabilities? How can I diversify? What's the way you go about this breakdown of an order that we're talking about?
No, thank you, Nicola. No, to say it, to take it from the end. Of course, I'm convinced we need different concepts. Perhaps we need to be creative. But in order to explain where we need to be creative, I would like to start from the beginning. And I'm coming from the trade side, of course. I still believe in a rules-based system, of course, and or I defend a rules-based system. I don't believe that we would start in a world where everybody uses its power, its trading power, to get whatever they want. In kind of deals world, we have this approach seen recently from the US, closing the deals with different trading partners, with the bigger, with the smaller partners. Now we definitely believe in a system where we start from a rules-based system where, in the best of the worlds, everybody would adhere to these rules. We have the GATT system, the WTO system later, and we have a lot of free trade area systems above this system. So these are basic rules, and then above there is a system of free trade arrangements in the best of the world. But of course, we see it doesn't work. Not in all circumstances. The world has changed. Marian said this very, very clearly. We live in a different world. We have to see that we have three big trading blocks. There's one that turns out to be more protective, more protectionist than before, and we have a very strong competitor from China using a lot of subsidies, and we as Europeans are in the middle with all the difficulties we have as Europeans. In order to bring legislation out, in order to form a unanimous opinion, it's not always so easy, and we are not the biggest trading bloc. But we are a trading bloc, and of course we have to see what others do. I don't agree with completely with what Wolfgang Niedermark said, that nobody adheres to the rules anymore. There are still many outside who really follow the rules, and it was mentioned already partners we have as Japan, Korea, Canada, and others. I'm going tomorrow to a meeting of the so-called CPTPP. This is a group of countries in the Pacific, including but Canada, Peru, and others. And they are of the same opinion. They follow the rules, and then they have to see what kind of adjustment. And now about what kind of adjustment. We work very closely together with our colleagues in industrial policy, and there are some examples where we see. Especially those examples or those sectors where there is strong subsidies behind that, we cannot just trade by the rules. Let's take the steel aluminum sector. We need some kind of protection. We have huge overcapacities made basically by China, but not only coming from China, but also by diverse ways. Then we have instruments, of course. We have instruments in the rules-based system. We have anti-dumping laws. We have anti-subsidy rules. We use this according to the rules of the system as far as we have it. But we have the situation with China, and we've seen it in the slides also. There are subsidies all over the production chain. It's not only the subsidies we address in the rules-based system. There are other subsidies, they are not addressed at all. So we need some kind of countervailing system. What we do is, in the steel sectors, we would use safeguards. We're just about developing a new safeguard system that is perhaps not completely compatible with the WTO system, but it builds on it. And it will be issued in the next days to see how we can regulate this. This is industrial policy coming out to defend there. We have to apply subsidies in order to transform the industry. It's highly expensive here. We cannot compete with those subsidizing all over the place. Another example is the critical minerals, where we have seen the export restrictions, where it's a completely different situation, but we are dependable there. We are dependable from this imports. And we are vulnerable also, because if we see that permanent magnets are not coming, we have to shut down the whole industry using this, and with some other other critical minerals. So we need to develop a different approach, and there we are in industrial policy, how to work together, how to subsidize perhaps this sector, how to ring fence the sector against these dependencies, identify the choke points where we are vulnerable, and then make a system between like-minded where we can work together. And then we are in the middle of industrial policy, because we are talking about local production, perhaps more European production than before. Even the extraction process has to be taken place in other countries, not only in China. Mm-hmm. The processing has to take place in other countries, and there we are in the middle. And there are some proposals we can talk later about how we can do this.
Perfect. Thank you. And maybe before I go to Sonali and talk a bit more about the analytics of all of this, I want to come back to you, Marion, and ask you, because you said, well, maybe we need different ways to think about supply chains, to bring together countries that can work on, doing something about over-dependencies, excess capacities, etc. So I have two questions. One is, in this world, in this new world, how can countries still work together to avoid really inefficient subsidy races that are inefficient for all of them and create fiscal problems? And related to that, what are the other instruments? What are the other ways countries can work together to adjust and enable trade, make sure that everything can stay the same with very new instruments? What are these instruments? What were you thinking about concretely?
Well, first, I think one can see this interim period as a period that indeed shapes new rules, because I think there's an understanding among most WTO members that change is needed. There is a WTO reform process. Second, the term resilient supply chains, it appeared in the ministerial statement of the Abu Dhabi Ministerial Conference of the WTO. So there is already a hook to think differently. And third, I would maybe like to say that the system has gone through such an upheaval period already before, in the 80s, when Japan suddenly became such an important exporter. The system also went through a period where the United States was restricting imports from Japan, asked them to implement voluntary export restrictions. And that was also a period where there were numerous sectorial agreements between the US and Japan, including for automobiles, for instance. I may be more optimistic in the sense that I would want to see it as an opportunity. That crisis is a threat and an opportunity. There is an opportunity hidden here. What are other instruments? There are the subsidies. There are the tariffs for temporary protection. There is Or there are, of course, the standard elements like upskilling of the labor force in order to move into new technologies. There are, as I mentioned before, if you want to work more together with like-minded countries, and that language is popping up in the discussions I mentioned on steel, on critical minerals or in others, there is the possibility to work among common standards so that you only let products that meet a certain standard when they are being produced. It can be environmental standards, labor standards. You let these countries, these products flow within the group of like-minded countries and protect that flow temporarily or for a longer time against inflows from others. Hopefully a temporary measure, hopefully something that can be multilateralized at a certain stage. But maybe in an interim period, this is something that that could be done. Then there are aspects of industrial policies that also China has well applied, overcoming coordination failures. If you want e-vehicles to be sold, there has to be a system where these vehicles can be loaded. So you make sure that you have the loading stations in place when you start to produce the cars. And there's a coordination between what the government invests in and what companies are asked to invest in. The one advantage a huge country like China has is that they can implement industrial policy whilst having at the same time competition, high levels of competition, because their own market is so big. And therefore it's possible in a huge country like this that notwithstanding the support from the government, you end up identifying, you end up having really efficient companies rising to the top, and those companies are then also efficient at a global level, potentially even once you take the protection and the industrial policy away.
Thanks, Marion. And now, Sonali, I think in these, with all the inputs you've heard about already, I would like you're a trade researcher here at DIW, currently in the United States. That's why you're not sitting with us. But from the perspective of a trade researcher, would you agree that we are in a completely different trade regime and you also need new methods, or also need to think about new instruments if you want to understand how countries can make sure that they benefit from trade when the playing field is not as level as it used to be? I would like to hear from you about this.
Perhaps I can begin with just a bit of context. So, over the past 3 decades, we've seen these global supply chains really expanding dramatically. And that expansion has, generated economic gains for countries, for firms and consumers. But in this process of optimizing only for cost, we've seen that production has become highly concentrated in specific nodes of the global trade network. And now we're seeing that this concentration has serious consequences because a shock in one location can ripple across multiple downstream industries. And so this question of diversifying supply chains, de-risking, is becoming much more prominent and a new way of thinking about trade that we haven't seen before. So I agree with sort of the panel's assessment on that front, that we are no longer in the WTO world of the early 2000s, perhaps. And we have to really contend with these questions of hard geopolitical power and how they're playing into negotiations in FTAs and industrial policy. On the question of data and methods, I think what we still lack is, granular firm-level data and methods that can detect trade vulnerabilities several tiers deep in the supply chain, and not just at the level of the final imports. We have some very interesting work coming out even from the European Commission, which is developing a super useful framework where we can identify products for which imports come from a narrow set of countries, which play a significant role in Europe's import basket and which cannot easily be substituted with EU domestic production. And by that definition, around 370 products, this is roughly 9% of all EU imported products, are considered vulnerable. So identifying these vulnerabilities is important. And I think we're seeing lots of ongoing efforts to measure these dependencies using trade data. But I think what we really need to push on is to understand for particular firms and across their entire supply chain where they might be indirectly exposed to these shocks, through their third or fourth tier suppliers, for instance. So that's something that's on the in my homework, at least, what I have to work on as a trade economist. And in addition to that, we've also been analyzing trade dependencies, looking at the past import patterns of countries. But I think this might be a poor predictor of where future dependencies will lie, especially as industrial policy is going to change production capacity pretty rapidly across sectors and countries. So we need much more work on how to anticipate the next bottlenecks with new tools and much richer data, which tells us how firms actually source inputs, how are they finding new buyers, how do they respond to these supply shocks, and so forth. So I hope that sort of addresses your question.
Sonali, but it brings me to a question because Marion, Sonali now talked about, well, we need more microdata to understand the vulnerabilities, also see the bottlenecks of the future. That's a bit like, addressing the downsides or the risks. But I'm wondering if you had this data, more insights into how these supply chains really work, wouldn't it be possible to also detect your own strength that you can then use when you negotiate with other countries, the like-minded ones or the less like-minded ones, about how you organize trade in a more strategic world, let's say?
Yes, it's definitely, it's a phenomenon of our times that companies realize, also companies, not only policymakers, realize that it's in their interest to understand the supply chain. It was also an important topic if you want to ensure environmental sustainability along the supply chain. It's important to know who your supplier is at the different tiers of the supply chain. Yes, it can be to your own advantage. Then you understand where you have negotiation potential yourself or coercion potential. But the other thing is that at a very granular level, many countries may not want those kind of data or that kind of analysis to be in the hands of other countries or necessarily in the public sector, because the real vulnerabilities you do not necessarily want to be known too much. Mm-hmm. So the aspect that was just mentioned of as trade economists not being well positioned to analyze at the granular level how the supply chain functions, that's something indeed that we became very aware of already a bit during COVID-19, but then very aware after the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And this network that I just mentioned to you, the Trade Chief Economist Network, it was created for that reason, because lead economists in all ministries and in OECD, so myself, we realized policymakers want to know where the next bottleneck is, and I don't know how to start thinking about this. Mm-hmm. We did not have models or data in place for this. We have improved the data sets. We have improved our modeling on this. We are probably not there where we would want to be. But this is indeed ongoing work that is very, very important. Mm-hmm.
So talking about this, you told us, Wolfgang, very clearly that many countries, many companies really, you sort of have to accompany them in this transformation of global markets. And I have a few follow-up questions regarding this. So one was, we heard, German companies, right, in the past, when markets opened in Eastern Europe or China, they used that very skillfully to become efficient and competitive, etc. And my question here is, did we globalize or did they globalize in a way that sort of they don't have the overview anymore where their vulnerabilities lie and how they can adjust? Or can we trust them a little bit more? And when circumstances change, they are able to adjust because they did so in the past. That would be something. Well, maybe I leave it there for the moment because that's already
a very important question. You say we collect data to see our next vulnerabilities. We have seen them. the data was not the problem. We have published papers on the scarcity of raw materials, critical rare earths, all this precious metal stuff 12, 15 years ago. We even started an initiative with huge corporations when we recognized what's going on. And then China was a little bit flexible enough and cooled down the markets and minimize prices, and so all our business models were broken. So we stopped being sensitive for these bottlenecks or vulnerabilities, whatever you would like to call it. So we have to blame ourselves, including the companies that we had all the data. We could see the problem coming, and nobody did anything. So we have to be really open to this self-assessment, criticism, I don't know. The thing was that we were in a totally different mode how to deal with international trade relations and supply chains. It was only driven by efficiency. You mentioned it many times, and you still dream of efficiency, that we come back to efficiency. My theory is it's over for the time being. It's only resilience. Strategic resilience. And efficiency, of course, comes with a very pleasant effect of cost savings. And resilient comes with a very unpleasant effect of a price tag, an extra premium. And companies have to learn and to be willing to pay for that. That will affect your balance sheet in the end and your profits. And you have to be ready to pay for it. And on a larger scale, countries have to be willing to pay for it. In particular, when it's getting more complicated than just industrial value chains. We mix everything together. That is, of course, fundamental security issues. Then you have all kind of political well-behavior in certain questions, which is also part of the discussion. And that is, trade policy is not an isolated realm of some trade specialists, is now embedded into a very complicated system of international relations. Development cooperation, security, raw material, water, climate, of course. And that has to be seen together now, which makes it really, really unpleasant and complicated for strategy people in the corporates, which have not been educated to do that. My generation of managers is always educated, well, go out and do business with your friends and even North Korea as your friend. And so that was the way we did not see the danger. Now we learn it the hard way. And my prediction is it's getting harder. We are not yet at this point where we have seen the final marker of this destruction. It's an ongoing process. Of course, we will find some answers and to muddle through the whole thing until we finally, in 5, 6, 7 years, we find a new order. But in between, we have to be very transactional and flexible in order to survive first.
And well, a follow-up question to this, because it sounds like, well, in the past, these German companies, they were very good at using open markets because it was mainly about efficiency, that they knew how to do it.
For us,
Now they have to think about resilience. It's a real investment. You also have to sort of do risk assessments. Where can I trade? Where shouldn't I, perhaps? And you need different kind of managers, you said. My question there would be, well, I imagine big companies, for them it's perhaps easier to hire the right staff, to have strategic thinkers, but relatively small German companies, Mittelstand, they were also very successful internationalizing. Will it be more difficult for them to do this kind of change?
I would say don't underestimate the small and family-owned business. Sometimes they're really smarter than the big ones. And they have a clear strategic view on where they come from. Of course, a huge multinational corporation has a totally different perspective on the whole thing because it's operating in a very sophisticated global production network, with all parts represented in all markets, a hidden champion, really more exporting than investing everywhere, might have a different view on that, and that is more based on European and German interests on your location. A multinational corporation might lose that in parts at a certain stage, because of course you have billions of investments elsewhere, which are also to be defended. And you have to do that in a continuation, even on markets where you see the problems. Of course, my former company has to invest in China. I fully understand why they do it. But that's a different setup we are talking about here. Perhaps one comment on this less like-minded countries. That's what I found interesting when you mentioned it. Yes, of course, we are totally on the same page with CPTPP. That is a perfect match for many of those companies involved. And maybe European Union should think about applying to be part of CPTPP. But of course, we have also strategic interest with not like-minded countries. Just the other week, the Egyptian foreign minister was here. I wouldn't say Egypt is a classical like-minded partner for us. But of course, we have joint interests. They don't want to be totally 100% dependent on US and China, in particular China. They are really open for cooperation with us. And we have a certain interest in raw materials, in trade issues, in infrastructure projects in Egypt. They are investing a lot. So even if you are not a classical like-minded, you can be a strategic partner. Or Congo. Of course, we also would like to be part of this Congo raw materials story. By the way, perhaps with a better offer, with better standards, with human rights, with environment protection. Perhaps we turn even out to be the better partner for DRC than China in the end. We have to make the better offer, and that I'm always looking at my colleague Vanessa, she's in charge for development cooperation. We have a total different concept on that. Make the better offer, but look at your own interests and find partners, perhaps even in environments where it's not called like-minded.
Very interesting. And Christian, I want to bring you in again, because Wolfgang Niedermark said, well, you know, you can't think about trade policy in an isolated way anymore. It has to be the connection between security policies and another important point. Well, it's not perhaps about common values often, but about common interests, and then understanding, well, whether you can work together based on these interests mainly, or whether there are too many risks. So does your work as a trade policy maker change in that way too, that you have to embed it more into the general strategy of how does Germany, how does Europe position itself in the world, not only on the trade dimension, but also in the international security dimension and others?
Yeah, that's true. I strongly believe that we cannot think it separately. You cannot think trade policy and security policy as it was perhaps in the past. You have to certainly think it together, and this comes when identifying those sectors where we are vulnerable. I mentioned already steel and aluminum, but thinking more from a security perspective, we have to think about the very new technologies as well that we are developing, and we don't want to see them in the wrong hands here. This is starting with biodiversity, quantum technologies, the semiconductors mentioned already, everything what's happening in artificial intelligence that are new sectors where trade takes place also, and we have to take into account at the same time our security interests. So that's when, even if somebody builds up a wind park, we need to think about the technology applied. It's not only the blades or something we have to develop, it's also the technical stuff inside the turbines, that we don't want to have the data migrating to countries where we don't want to see them, that we don't want anybody to have the ability to build in a kill switch and cause a blackdown or something else. So this is where we have to think this together. And the European Union, as you mentioned, just brought out their European security doctrine a few days ago, and where all these issues are in, and of course, as trade politicians, we are part of this discussion. We are part of the discussion within the Commission, but also with other member states in the EU and with the US and others in certain technologies, depending always on what we're talking about.
Sonali, if it's true that policymakers, but also industrial organizations or associations and companies think about trade differently, more in a, let's say, in an interdisciplinary whole of the picture way, is that also resonating in academia? So do you have to work differently on trade because you have to think about security issues at the same time? And perhaps connected to that, do you also think about different instruments? We talked about tariffs and subsidies, but is it also about, for example, the standards that can shape a new world where there's still some efficiency gains and trades, but in a different way, perhaps?
Thank you for that question. Of course, there's been dramatic change in the way economists are thinking about trade. We understand that we can't be the only technical experts guiding the formation of trade policy, since it has so many social implications. It has labor market effects, it has political economy effects. We've seen the backlash against globalization in the US and other countries, giving rise to far-right thinking. So certainly, I think trade economists have to work more cooperatively with businesses who have data, as I've just learned, on vulnerabilities and bottlenecks. So closer cooperation with industry, closer cooperation with other civil society actors. I think that's the future I see for academic research, and leaving the ivory tower a bit more, I would say. On the second question, on new instruments, you mentioned standards, and I think this is one of the ways in which smaller economies that cannot outspend or don't have the same firepower as China in doing industrial policy can find a way to compete and still be relevant for emerging technologies. By forming these cooperation blocks, whether they're along geopolitical lines or through finding common interests, I think we need to see more of these new ways of organizing. Marian mentioned several initiatives that are already coming into play on steel, on battery alliances, and so forth. And I think this is sort of a very exciting way of pushing and continuing to deepen trade, even in the current geopolitical climate. Just to give you a sense of the numbers, I was looking at China's overseas investments in clean green tech, and the numbers are just staggering. Chinese firms have committed around $230 billion in around 400 green manufacturing projects in more than 50 countries, from Indonesia to Morocco and the Gulf states. And in inflation-adjusted dollars, this is more than the $200 billion Marshall Plan. So to put it bluntly, China is really building this end-to-end control of green supply chains, from solar to batteries to wind turbines and green hydrogen. And its firms are bringing this capacity to the developing world, with many global South economies eager to expand their own industrial capacity. And what we see Washington doing is offering tariffs and policy chaos. So I don't see this as a way to win the geopolitical contest of this century. So I think the way forward for OECD economies is really to invest in this cooperation, which makes both strategic and economic sense. Pool resources, align standards, coordinate industrial policies, and potentially plan these bilateral investments. And the how of this is, of course, tricky, but I'm hopeful about these new alliances that Marian mentioned.
But Sonali, I want to make a follow-up question here, because, well, you were mentioning these staggering numbers, how China is already there for the green industrial policy supply chains. Wolfgang Niedermark said, well, maybe we can make a better offer. My question is, but does the EU, does Germany, do the OECD countries even try to make a better offer at the moment in terms of scale, but perhaps also in terms of quality? What do you see in the data when you look at it?
That's an excellent question. So I think what the EU, and perhaps I should say broadly, OECD economies can offer is more knowledge transfer and exchange with like-minded partners, and in the framework of also these new free trade agreements that are coming up. I think it's well established that several of the OECD economies, they're really at the cutting edge in advanced manufacturing, and these capabilities are something that can be built upon with smart industrial policy decisions. So I do think that there's certainly something more to offer in terms of knowledge transfer that global South economies would be interested in. Just to give an example, I was in discussions with policymakers in India who are part of trying to bring Apple's supply chain to Tamil Nadu, which is one of the big states in India that's become the manufacturing hub in recent years for electronics and semiconductors and so forth. And they're very interested in actually moving up the supply chain, not just doing packaging and designing, but not just doing assembly and packaging, but also trying to acquire new capabilities. So I think there are some very interesting, productive ties and synergies that could emerge between European or other OECD firms that have this know-how, but are still perhaps contending with high labor costs at home, as well as other global South economies that have perhaps easier and more capabilities on the manufacturing side, and who are interested in also industrial upgrading.
Yeah, I want to bring you in because I'm thinking about we're talking about these possibilities to build new partnerships also with countries outside of the OECD. And the OECD already has a few mechanisms, right? For example, with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which is more seen now, perhaps when you discuss it with companies in Germany. Well, I'm not sure whether they are aware, but this standard is underlying many of the laws that companies see as very bureaucratic, like the CSDDD or the German supply chain law. But at the same time, it offers mechanism to work with, let's say, Congo or other raw material-rich countries in order to ensure sustainable supply chains, for example. And you can use that, of course, also to build resilient supply chains. There's the Climate Club and other OECD initiatives to talk about decarbonizing, industrial decarbonization, also the supply chains. So are there mechanisms there that could be used to build partnerships like that would...
Yeah, absolutely. We have a long history of working with non-OECD countries. So first, we have an interesting list of accession countries, right? So in Latin America, those are Peru, Argentina, and Brazil, and in Asia, Thailand and Indonesia. And Indonesia was one of the critical raw mineral producers that I referred to before. So with these countries, and my team, two of my teams were in Indonesia in the past 2 weeks, actively discussing their accession process. So we have strong collaboration already going on. Then there are other mechanisms around standard setting, indeed, where in really variable geometries, countries work together. Some of the oldest are on the agriculture side, actually, in my team. So we certify the quality of seeds. And I think currently 80 countries are part of this quality certification scheme. So many are outside of the OECD, and actually many in Africa. And we are expanding in Africa right now. So these collaborations can be set up in the way that is most of interest. But I would like to come back to your question of are we making a better offer? Are we working on making a better offer? And in this context, it's important to be collaborating in making a better offer. Because there was one question you asked me that I didn't answer. How do we avoid wasteful competition among each other? And there also we have examples of mechanisms where we do this. The OECD hosts something that is called the OECD Export Credit Arrangement. And Germany, in this case Euler Hermes, is part of this. And what does this arrangement say? it's an arrangement where members are export credit agencies, and export credit agencies, they support often investments and business of companies, notably big investment projects, including in the energy sector, including to build mines. And they support this with credits to exports, and these credits come at a better rate than the market gives. Now, if you want to build a mine in Congo, then maybe Germany's interest, Japan's interest, US's interest, or each agency goes in, and you can end up competing against each other. So that is then wasteful competition in terms of support from the governments. Now, to avoid this waste, OECD countries came together and agreed that they would not compete against each other. So there's minimal rules you have to apply if you want to invest, if you want to provide an export credit, for instance, to build a wind park or to invest in mines. Now, that arrangement a few years ago became less and less competitive as arrangement members. So our members were saying, we are all the time outcompeted by China. So China's getting all the business, we don't. And hence, a few years ago, the agreement was modernized, and it was made easier for export credit agencies belonging to this arrangement. Now, most of them are from the OECD, but in some areas, Brazil is, for instance, a member when it comes to aircraft. And therefore, it was made easier to compete against China, and it was made extra easy, so even more lenient conditions, if you wanted to compete in environmentally friendly projects. And so therefore, yes, work is going on to support OECD countries to be more competitive. And there are a number of initiatives, this is one of them, where members are trying to collaborate in order, yes, to compete with countries that are not part of the group, but not to outcompete each other in order to avoid a huge waste of taxpayers' money.
But it's still, if I listen to you, it's still complicated not to have wasteful subsidy races if there's one country or several countries that are not part of the group trying to negotiate how to step back from subsidies, right? So that's really difficult.
Yeah, it's not. It is not straightforward. But in order to find solutions, it is important, I think, to start by identifying where the problem is, where the difficulties are, and doing as if the difficulty doesn't exist will not help.
Yeah. Christian Vorwig, Wolfgang Niedermark said, he said, well, we know how to do efficiency, and but that game is over. Now it's going to be all about resilience and investments. But I mean, it's not really your remit, but I still want to come back to something Marion said earlier about the big market that China is, and that for them, if they put subsidies into a race, the most efficient company can be first, and then they can expand in world markets. And it made me think about the EU and the fact that, maybe there are efficiency gains from trade to be had among EU countries, given that the internal market is far from completed. So wouldn't that be also in order to compete then with other big players, if we have markets with big economies of scale? Isn't that very urgent too, to be successful in the international game where the EU looks outward and what's being done there? What can we hope for?
Yes, certainly. That's the other side of the medal, of course. We have to make the EU more competitive. We have to make the single market really more competitive. And we've seen that even with the tariffs put in place by the United States, much compensation has been done already by the single market, but there's more potential in it. We don't have, for example, a capital union up to date, and I think we should definitely have politicians in the future to take these steps to be more united as Europeans, to be stronger as Europeans, and to integrate the single market, to use the potential that really is in this big zone of, I don't know the number, how many million people live in the EU, and how many possibilities are there. So we should definitely do this, and I think at least what I see from the political discussions, what I see not now from the trade perspective, I'm not part of this single market discussions. It's more the European division, but what I see is that everybody's thinking about how to make this possible, and I think there's a huge potential.
And we have had Draghi, who has written it all down.
Exactly.
We have a Draghi report. Formerly, we always said the problem is that China has a strategy and we don't.
Yes.
These times are over. We have a strategy. Draghi was kind enough to write it for us. And of course, your question is absolutely perfect. Big part of this strategy is the single market, the European market. And in the beginning, I said change by trade is working. We are changing ourselves according to the example of others. It sounds really like dual circulation. Huh? Mm-hmm. So let's start to make our own market, which is huge and cannot profit from all the potentials we have. So far, we have not made the best out of it. Let's do it in the first step and re-industrialize and work on our competitiveness. And then in the second step, go back to our good old export-driven model, and technology transfer to the rest of the world might be the second step. By the way, the Americans do the same, America first. Mm-hmm. And we even use the same terms now, buy European. That's how it started with Biden. He was not saying America first, but buy American. Now we have announced buy European. That's the trend. Mm-hmm. That's where we are heading to. Now we are talking about European preferences in supply chains. That's where we are. That's what I described, what we don't like, that we have to get into it. The next generation of people, the decision makers, have to deal differently to what we in our generation have learned so far. It's a completely different situation.
But in order to exploit, let's say, gains from trade within the internal market, there are no tariffs, obviously, but there are a lot of, let's say, non-tariff barriers to having a more efficient, larger market. From your perspective as a trade economist, what are the main points that need to be addressed in order to exploit a larger market for EU member countries? And that's a different question, but since we had it by European, by US, how do you see, what does that do to you as a trade economist when you hear it? Do you think it can be a good strategy in the world as it is, or do you think, oh no?
Very existential questions. So I think on deepening the EU single market, this is, of course, one of the surest ways of shielding against the trade shocks we've seen in recent times. We ran some simulations following the announcement of the Liberation Day tariffs with our trade models, and we see that reducing these non-tariff barriers, one could think of this as red tape or other kinds of frictions that impede cross-border movement of goods or people within the single market. Removing these dampens the negative impact of US tariffs, especially if these tariffs remain at elevated levels in the medium to long term. So I'm completely in agreement that we need to fasten up or accelerate this deepening process of the market. And perhaps I can add that the single market, it brings scale that allows firms to spread fixed costs. And in that sense, it's a very important ingredient to, thinking of industrial strategy, but it's doing much more than scale. I think it also allows for learning spillovers and the movement of skilled people within the market. And I think both of these factors are very important to building technological capabilities. First on the learning part, we have pretty strong and rich evidence that firms firms learn a lot by interacting with foreign buyers and suppliers. And these relationships push firms to upgrade quality, improve processes, adopt new standards and products. So without these cross-border interactions, firms potentially innovate less. And we lose exactly the kind of productivity growth that we want to unleash through industrial strategy. And also the single market, in a sense, brings movement of people. And if you look at innovation, this is increasingly a process of bringing diverse sets of knowledge, disciplines, and technologies together. And that requires being open to talent. Skilled workers from within the single market, but also internationally, can bring qualifications, experience, networks, and ways of thinking that might be hard to replicate domestically. And when I think about the Silicon Valley story, it's now central to understanding why openness to kind of skilled workers in some sectors matters a lot. So I think the single market can really push on both these aspects, the capital union, but also really helping with worker transitions within the market so we can kind of build productive capacities across member states.
And the bi-European one, the other existential question, if you want to answer, Sonali. Bi-American.
It is disappointing. I have to be honest about it, because it really lends itself to a very insular way of thinking that consumers should necessarily, prefer domestic varieties over foreign varieties, irrespective of cost, advantages, or quality, etc. But I do understand that trade is not just about economic costs and gains, but we really have to factor in these national security and other non-economic objectives. And so I would say I'm not completely at peace with this way of thinking, but perhaps there are ways to find the middle ground. So perhaps really deepening trade within geopolitical blocks. So not perhaps having a completely open markets the way we did prior to all these geopolitical shocks, but still being open to ideas and people and goods, perhaps to a smaller set of countries. I suppose that's where we're heading.
Thanks, Sonali. And I think we're slowly but surely approaching the end of our discussion, but I realized that, so it's the beginning of our dialogues and we are not quite yet, we are building capacity. I realized I had no way to interact with our online audience. So I'm sure there were many questions which I don't know about. Next time we'll be better prepared. I would take, we haven't discussed it, Tommaso, but we do have a mic. So if there are questions in the audience, I would take one or two, perhaps. There's already one. Can we carry around the microphone? Okay, brilliant. Yeah, and I do have one more. Yes, please. And please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation, which was very interesting. And it's a perfect moment to create new alliances, interdisciplinary alliances with different stakeholders. My name is Isabella Maveglia from Greener EU. We are a Berlin-based organization who works together with patronages and EU funding to create new opportunities on cultural heritage valorization, which is an instrument, for example, is the Faro Convention, which is a convention stated by the Council of Europe, which was signed in 2005, which has not been yet ratified in Germany. So I would have a question specifically, as the European Union is giving a lot of funding for cultural heritage valorization. So that could be the good news for the German-produced historical heritage. How the Council of Europe supports the common European identity, and the European Union is giving funding available for this kinds of processes, like in the research and innovation in Horizon Europe, there are 95 billion euro available, and the German government might not currently be benefiting fully from the fundings available to save those historic companies, because the Faro Convention, for instance, has not been ratified or signed yet because of some maybe technical issues. So could that be a good opportunity to look forward? And and how can other tools, like apart from the Faro Convention, the European funding for the Mobilize program, which has been funded from the European Union, but then sort of was forgotten and not refinanced, in the exchange between small and medium enterprises throughout the European Union can be used as a tool to be more efficient and to use trade within the European Union to exchange expertise and know-how. And how can the creation of support also for artisanal and craftsmanship, like, you know, in Venice, the classic question, like, why are the artisans dying out and why is there unfair competition? But we can see the same thing in historic companies, like German companies, like the porcelain. Cultural heritage is very sad to see that, like, losing. And how can we talk further more, apart from only the competitiveness, which is very hard to talk, to compete between a very high quality good, which respects the standards for non-slavery and all these very important democratic rights, and how can there be unfair competition where there is some low quality, mass-produced, high negative externality evoking goods. So how can we protect through European legislation these kind of things whilst using the instruments? I think these are three valid tools and also questions and challenges that we might face, but we have the tools, so how can we work on that productively together? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'm aware. Are you familiar with the FAO Convention?
Never heard about it.
Yeah, it's yeah, perhaps it's something. So we will have an opportunity. We will have a more casual part of the event. Maybe we will need to discuss it there, unless anybody has something to say on these. No,
but perhaps in general terms, I'm not familiar with the convention, but in general terms, I think it's the qualitative approach that Europe uses usually when we try to subsidize something. We are free to set our own standards here. For example, avoiding slavery or avoiding forced labor components. Also, this is we are able to do this. This is completely legal, and we're using this. And if it comes to financing, we're also allowed to finance certain standards. Of course, if you mentioned cultural heritage, for example, we are free to use this. The problem comes only when we subsidize this for export. To be more competitive than others because we don't use this here in Europe, we export it outside Europe. Then it becomes difficult because then we get a competitive advantage that's not allowed. But
because there is the conflict between free market and not valorization of cultural heritage. Because but in the moment that you adhere to the Faro Convention and you do state that you are protecting cultural heritage, that is actually very good. And maybe that was sort of forgotten. I mean, it's a recent convention. It's 2005. It's been ratified, for instance, in Italy just in 2020. So it would be a good moment to retake that in the hands. Also, along with the Mobilize program, which is microfunding for exchanges between European companies and other things that are currently, these are very practical things that the funding is available. Just, in the practice, it needs to be relooked at.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to come back before we close, Marion. I want to come back to one. Well, you mentioned a number of gatherings at the OECD to think about, this new world of trade. And when we were talking about dependency on raw materials and how do we deal with it and buy European, it reminded me of one of those recent gatherings on, I think it was the Forum on Critical Supply Chains, where you bring together representatives from industry, from research, trade, chief economist. And we had a session about the car industry, so the electric vehicles. You talked about a lot in your talk, and I was quite impressed how, there were different managers, high-level managers who are in the electric vehicle sector, and they all seem to say, well, the way we secure access to these critical raw materials is circular economy within Europe. So do you think that is an underestimated tool that countries can think, companies and countries can think more about, and could be a solution for the German, the European car industry when moving to electric vehicles?
It's definitely something to think about, and there is thinking about it, and there is action in this area. But also there, a country like China thought about this early on. So, for instance, when it comes to battery recycling, lithium battery recycling, they, I think, already have 80% or more of the global market. These are areas where that have heavy economies of scale. So once you have a critical mass, you are probably going to stay in the market. Scrap and waste is also an area where we see a lot of export restrictions. So we see that export restrictions are probably being used in order to start building that critical mass to have the recycling industry at home. So same story as with the e-vehicle. One player, China in this case, has already thought of it, has already a dominant position, and unusual measures, the ones we didn't necessarily like so much a few years ago, like export controls, are being used to build this capacity elsewhere. And if we do not collaborate among like-minded countries or with others in this area, then we are going to shoot ourselves very much in each other's feet, and we will probably be wasting a lot of money. So collaborating in new ways for a certain period, hopefully by keeping that collaboration open for other players, is maybe one of the most positive ways forward in this interim period, and a way to keep a bit of optimism in the discussion.
Perfect. I think we should close with a word of optimism, but also, making sure that all players are aware that others are thinking and racing in various fields. Thank you, Marion. Thank you, Wolfgang Niedermark. Thank you, Christian. And thank you, Sonali, for this inspiring kickoff of our industrial strategies dialogues. You're all invited now, so our friends from DIW are opening their lounge now for us to have a more informal discussion. And, well, thank you very much for coming and for thinking with us about this important issue.
Thank you.